So folks, as you know, we're in the process of bringing some Illustrator artwork into After Effects. We're then going to animate it through the next sequence of tutorials. And then in the final sessions, we're going to export that animation into Lottie, in the Lottie format using plugins. We use a couple of different routes. And produce a Lottie animation which can be used in Adobe XD with a plugin, or it can be used in web pages, etc. So Lottie is a format that is basically a condensed animated vector format that allows us to put some very cool animation into web pages, apps, etc. With relatively tiny files, etc. So in the previous tutorials we opened an existing logo we adapted it for, in this case, widescreen display format, and we stacked in Illustrator those assets into a number of different layers ready for this in preparation. So now we're in After Effects and we're going to we've effectively created a new project. So I just went project and new project, and that's created this untitled project. And we could click new composition, but there's no need. If we bring in the footage, it will automatically create a composition to house it. So in the top here where we have the project window, this is like the bin where you kind of put assets that you're going to be using. So you can either double click in here, which will bring up the import option, or you can go up to the file and import option here, import file or multiple files. I'm just lazy, so I use the double click. And that brings up a dialog box. So if you remember, I saved it on the desktop, and it was called, we had two files. We had the animation prep, which was the first stage when we sort of stacked it, but we left the background in, and then we did the layers to export. So I'm going to import that. Now this is going to give me options in terms of how to import that footage, and also how to understand it. So if I went for options here, it would merge layers. I could also choose to import as footage and choose a specific one and bring them in one at a time. That's a little bit painful. So I'm going to go for composition, and the footage dimensions are going to be the size of the layer, which, if you remember, we changed the document to 1080p, so that's 1920 by 1080 pixels. I'm just going to hit OK with that, and it will go away and bring it in. For a moment, it flashed on my previous project, which was a bit weird, on here. And it's automatically created two layers for me. Okay, now I get different things depending which machine I'm working on, so bear this in mind. When I'm demonstrating on a staff machine, often it creates two projects like this, two compositions effectively. Okay, so you can see this is the one it created by default, and then for some reason it creates a second one. Now I think that is because normally if you have this checkbox selected here, when I went to import, it is going to add an extra composition. Now normally I would deselect that, but I have found that when I'm on certain teaching machines it automatically creates a second one anyway. I'm just going to delete that second one because I don't need it, and I'm going to double click now. What you'll see is it's brought in my Illustrator file, but it's broken them into separate layers, so it's effectively bringing in, as it says, it recognizes it's vector art. You can see the Illustrator logo, and it's telling me what it is. So you can see this one's called A and that one's called Acumen. So they're not in the right order in here, but if I go to my composition and double click, it'll load, and hey presto, it's exactly the same order that it was in the Illustrator. Now, because I'm recording a slightly lower screen resolution, I'm already at 1080p. Obviously this can't show this at 100% because you can't fit the whole screen on with all the rest of the interface. So I'm just going to drop my display down to 50% in my preview thing up here so I can see the comp a bit better. But you can see in here it has brought in all the layers. So the ones that were hidden, if you remember, we made a copy of the word Acumen as a whole entity, which is here. And we also created separate versions of each letter in case, because we weren't sure at that stage what we were going to do with them. And it has brought all of those in, and we can hide and reveal and lock things. So that's the first stage. So that's just importing. So things to bear in mind when you double click is whether this create composition is on, and also in some cases up here, once you identify your file, let's just find it again, you can choose up here whether you want to import. So normally I would choose retain layer sizes, and I'd choose composition because I've already done the layering in Illustrator. You can see it knows it's an Illustrator document. I would deselect that, and I would then hit import. It's the same thing as I did. It's just a way of doing it in this box instead of the next. Okay. If you don't make those selections, it then brings up the dialog box that we saw the first time around. You will then get a folder with all of your individual layer assets broken apart into layers like this, and a composition that will automatically be produced. You can see it's read the document and it's understanding that it's a 1920 by 1080 composition. At the moment, it is gone for 10 seconds at 30 frames a second. That is the standard settings, but you can change that up here to different number of frames if you want. Okay. Now it depends. If I were doing this for film, for example, American NTSC standard is 29 frames per second. I can go for 30 frames. Quite often when I do stuff for Lottie, to be honest, I reduce it down to 15, and most people can't see when it's animated as separate assets. I'm just leaving it at the moment on the defaults. Okay. You can also see in here, it has sensed and put black in as the default. If it hadn't, I could just select and make sure that I dial in 000, and that would be black, which makes my composition black. Obviously, if I wanted to put it on grey, you can sort of see what the logo brand looks like on a dark grey. So if I preferred, I could go with that. From the point of the tutorial, moving forward, we're just going to leave it on black for now. Okay, and then I'll just close that off, or cancel in this case because I haven't made any changes. Okay, so that's the first tutorial. You can see how to import stuff, and we'll come back in a second and then we'll get busy with organizing the layers. I like to color code them. It just kind of helps with sanity. They're all default kind of gray at the moment, and actually when I'm skimming down trying to work out what I'm selecting, I find it useful to use the color tags. So we'll do that in the next tutorial. Join me in a minute.